Okay, welcome to the first course, the first class in GAIA. This is our meet and greet, and this is where we're going to start doing a dive into the overview, which just got released today. So I'm going to repeat myself here. I would love it if it's at all possible for you to go ahead and turn on your camera so that we can see each other's faces. There have been numerous studies done that show when it comes to virtual learning, we learn better, we have more fun, we're more present if our faces are on the screen. It doesn't matter what you look like. You can show up in your PJs, you can have schmutz on your face. We're going to love you and welcome you into this circle no matter what. So thank you all for being here. And if you're at work and you just can't, I totally get it, and I admire your commitment. All right, Judy, not a problem at all that your camera is in a box. So let me ask, does anybody have anything that they really feel called to share that's going to help you land in this room, that's going to help you feel seen, a very necessary request, or just something that's really pulling on your heart? Let's go ahead and just put it out there, and totally okay if not. Otherwise, we're going to kind of open up a little bit of a ritual container to get us synced up before we start the learning process. Also, so you know, I am like all about awkward silence. I think it's awesome and incredibly valuable. I could sit here for like a really long time just looking at your faces. I think it's great. It's like admiring beautiful flowers. Mm-hmm. or strange, beautiful birds. Does anybody have a strange, beautiful bird song? Does anybody want to write a strange, beautiful bird song on the spot? Maybe not now. It might be too soon. Next class. All right, next question. And feel free also. I like to hold a pretty free form container just so there's a little bit of room for spirit to come in. Like we got 30 something slides to go through, right? We're not going to be here. We're not going to be here all day, but I really want us to soak in the valuableness, valuableness, that is totally not a word. The value, though I'm all about creating new words, of letting spirit breathe, right? Of just being together and allowing those creative moments to happen. You're going to learn that is absolutely essential to going deep with our other than human allies. Being in those awkward free form spaces. It's like, we're not used to, in our culture, it's like there's no space to be bored. Right? Like we fill in all of our time with stuff. Right? It's like as soon as things stop, like we're on a train, we're waiting in line, we're at the doctor's office, what do? Stimulate, take me somewhere else. Right? There are whole realms of creativity and inspiration that we block out when we do that. Okay? There's so much connectivity that we lose. There's so much wisdom that we could be accessing in those moments that we just shut down because we jump to the screen. Okay, that being said, did anybody have a chance to, I know it just came out today, and I really apologize, there are a couple of typos in there. I'm going to be sending out a cleaned up version, but did anybody have a chance to give it a read?
No, I wanted to hear it from your beautiful mouth.
We're going to be doing that in a second here. I saw some hands though. Who read it? Jump in.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I wanted to ask a question.
Go for it.
Is news similar to nun in Egyptian Mythology?
So Nous is, thank you for asking. I should have explained that. So Nous is the all. Nous is the
Okay.
one in Hermeticism. So it's like the
Okay.
state of unification and the little seeds of intelligence that lie in every being are all Nous.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
So it's like the big creator God that is neither masculine nor feminine and knows no distinction.
Okay. Okay. So in all elements.
Yep.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, it's
Got
like the ultimate divine, like that first spark. Like if you think of, so in that, like in the story, right, of like Western science, Nous would be what existed before the Big Bang.
Okay.
And Nous would be
Okay.
the Big Bang itself.
Okay.
Excellent.
Thank you.
All right. Anybody have anything else that they want to remark upon before we start the slideshow? And we will have some time for the questions at the end. So, okay. All right. Chance, going once, going twice, going 3 times. All right, we're diving in. Okay. So can everybody see? Can you give me a thumbs up? Let me adjust the screen here a moment so that I can see more of you at once as we go through this. All right, so this picture here is an artistic rendering of Gaia as the Greek goddess, which I love. Okay, so clearly, we're not going to be going over absolutely everything in the overview, right? That would take a while. We're going to riff on some of the main points in the overview. Okay, so we open in the overview with the 7 principles of Gaia. And we're opening here because it's going to be really useful for us to establish some like base level principles and some vocabulary and basic tenets so that we can speak to each other more effectively. And yes, I will be sending out copies of the slides. And while we go through this, please go ahead and continue to pop questions in the chat. But I'm probably going to be looking at those questions sporadically. So if there's anything like really urgent, just go ahead and take yourself off mute. Okay, so let's dive into these principles. Okay, first principle, all that exists is composed of 4 elements. This is an easy one, right? Water, fire, earth, and air. There is, and before anybody says anything, I know somebody will, because I would if I were in your shoes, there is this idea of quintessence, right? And this idea of ether, that we're not thinking as being a forming principle per se of material reality, right? So, and we will get into that in a little more depth later on. All right, so the proportions of these elements and the nature of their dance or patterning create the distinction between beings that we apprehend with our senses, right? So this idea is that everything is made up of the elements, and what creates a difference and distinction is the way they move with each other, right? And how much of each element is inside of each, and how this happens, we're going to get to in the second principle. Okay, so all that exists on Gaia and throughout the universe is sentient, right? So everything contains that little spark of Nous. Everything is able to, in some way, interact with and respond to its environment. It has a personality. It is of God, right? And that even, and of course, this even includes plastics, right? Toxic chemicals created by man, your house, the drywall of your walls, everything is sentient, and everything can be communicated with. Everything can be communed with, right? And it might be more difficult, right, to communicate with some beings than other beings. Some beings might be more open or less open, but the possibility is still there. And I would add that it's essential, right? It's essential to our well-beings that we do acknowledge and communicate with life forms, even if it's in passing, but we make it just a general state of being that no matter what we're interacting with, we are in fact communicating with it. We don't have to be constantly pouring ourselves into communion with that other being, but it is going to be very useful for us if we develop the mindset that everything, all interactions, is a form of communication. There is information being sent and there is information being received on both ends. Okay. And of course, establishing this communication and building these partnerships is going to be the foundation of our work in building mastery of the elements. All right, the fourth principle, and I kind of already went through this. It is possible to communicate and indeed commune with all that exists. The level of difficulty in communication and communion stem from each being's level of openness and elemental kinship to the other, i.e. the being's capacity to love the other. Okay, and when I say that, do you know, we'll be able to understand all of these tenets a little bit more as the class goes on, but does that strike anybody as particularly odd? Right, this idea of, okay, all right, yeah, I thought that might be that notion of ability to love one another, like that's something we're definitely going to be building on even in this presentation. But I would love to hear somebody, I believe it was Peyton, and unfortunately Peyton, I can't see your face right now, but you raised your hand when I said, does that sound particularly odd? Would you tell me what sounds odd about that?
Hello, yes. Well, it came as an example of elemental kinship to the other. And so I was thinking it's like, so do elements that are kin to another element have the capacity to love more powerfully than other elements coming together?
In short, yes. In short, and this is going to be another tenet that we're going to look at, but yes, the closer the elemental kinship, the easier it is for love to be established.
And also, I think it's odd. Thank you for that. I think it's odd because what is love?
Great question, Peyton. What do you think?
Connection.
There's that. Do you think that non-loving connection can happen?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I think that love spans more than joy, per se. And so, I don't know, I'm really stuck with the question mark, and I have been for a while.
Is anybody familiar with the short story, What We Talk About When We Talk About Love? It became really famous in the movie Birdman. Does anybody remember Birdman? They were doing a play of the short story, What We Talk About When We Talk About Love. It's a fascinating story. It's a classic, and I recommend, if you have some time, to go ahead and dive in to that short story. This is clearly, you know, the question of what is love, right, is one that we're not necessarily going to be able to answer here shortly, though Peyton, I think you did an excellent job, and thank you. And we're going to get into it more, because love is actually, you're going to notice, is going to be one of the primary creative forces that we're going to be discussing. But for now, we're just going to kind of like let that sit with a pin in it. Okay. While we just know that love, whatever it is, and it's going to, the definition of love is going to unfold for each of us probably throughout our lives. But if you have a relationship with a goddess of love, right? Somebody like, you know, Aphrodite or Venus, right? In the Hermetic tradition, there are many other goddesses of love, Mary, right? I recommend you create, if you don't already have an altar to that goddess, that you go ahead and establish an altar to that goddess. And this will be something that we work on together, because calling that force in consciously is going to help us establish a knowing of what love is within ourselves and within our body. There's also, I can also recommend some other excellent books on the topic, but a lot of you probably know that the idea of love is better understood as a verb than a noun. Right? The idea of love is better learned in action rather than something that is static. I'm just going to put that in there. Right. And the next part of the fourth principle, depth of communication and communion stems from willingness to embrace the mystery or unknowable of the other. Right. So this principle is twofold. Right. So the ease of communication is established in likeness, right? Or what you know. Okay. Right. So it's easier to feel love or do love with something that you feel like you know, right? Like think about how easy it is to get stuck in toxic relationships that happen to resemble what we grew up with in our household, right? Like we naturally magnetize towards that because there's a comfort in it. There's an ease in it, but depth, right, actually comes from the unknown and willingness to sit with the unknown, to sit with and appreciate the mystery. Okay, these are deep principles that we're going to learn little by little, but we're just establishing that this is our intention, right? It's our intention to build both this capacity and this understanding. Excellent. Chloe agrees it's a verb. And oh, okay. I thought it said 13 people entered. It was just one person with 13 in the name. Okay. I personally think there are different kinds of love. So I think to explain love, I would have to describe it towards my kinds or my husband's, for example. Yes, exactly. Right. Examples or metaphor is how we know these abstract concepts. This is the role of the poet, right? And this is why the poet scientist, who the archetype of which we're going to be looking at in a minute, is so essential, right? And this is something that Stephen Herod Buhner, who was one of my herbal teachers and who was a true master, he really pressed. It's like looking at the world through a poetic lens, through a metaphorical lens, is so much more deep, so much more alive, so much more fulfilling, and so much more accurate than just clinically trying to splice and explain and thinking that it ends there, because it doesn't. Love is understood through metaphor. Love is understood by example, which is why it's important to understand it as a verb and why it's important to look for it in the natural world. Like, oh, I see that, seeing a bee, we talk about the birds and the bees, right? We see a bee being drawn towards a flower. Is that love? Right? Is that what love feels like to me right now? That movement of the drawing together, right? Because in a very simple way, love is a drawing together, right? Okay, wonderful. All right, honor and respect. I love that in love. Okay, so the fifth principle, The mastery of the elements opens doorways to miracle working and deification or gnosis in the Hermetic sense. A lot of big, perhaps unfamiliar words in there, except to those of you who have been through my husband's course Gnosis, in which case you probably understand this quite well. But for those of you who are not in Gnosis, do we have any questions? Feel free to put them in the chat or come off mute about this idea of miracle working as a part of deification or Gnosis. Just so you know, to define the term Gnosis briefly, Gnosis it means knowing, right? That, you know, the words that were written above the Delphic Oracle, know thyself, right? That seems simple on the surface, right? Until we begin to really look at those words, know and self. The word know is not at all simple. And the word self is not at all simple. Right? So that phrase contains profound mysteries within it. And when you really seek knowing, which requires love, which requires mystery and acceptance of mystery, right? And when you begin to define yourself in terms of your connectivity to your environment, right? This becomes really profound. And as you do this work, it does enable miracle working, right? And that might seem really grandiose, right? It might even seem arrogant in our culture to think that I can work miracles, or even think that I could try to work miracles, right? Because especially coming from a Christian context, it was Jesus who worked miracles, right? We hold these people way up here and way away from us, right? And build icons of them and say, well, they're gods, right? That's the Son of God, right? That's not, we're in this class, we're actually going to try to take that example, right? Using this mystic lens is like, okay, there's Jesus, and we're going to learn about a Jesus figure here in a second, whose lineage we're going to be pulling ourselves into, working towards joining, right? We're bringing that right here. Like actually doing that work of bringing those Jesus, those Christ-like figures into our heart and say, I will, you know, what would Jesus do? Like actually doing that, right? I am going to be Jesus, right? No, actually, I can be God. Actually, I am God. And that is a service to this world. In fact, that's the highest service that I can perform in this world. Because if I do that, that means that I have aligned myself with the will, the knowledge, and the power of this planet that I am a part of, in this universe that I live within. Right? So I can use my consciousness and I can perform my function as a human being in a much better way. Right? But of course, and we don't need to talk about this, but there's all kinds of forces that don't want you to do that. There's lots of people who would find it scary if there were lots of people who were, you know, empowering themselves. But it is possible, and it's not only possible, it's necessary. Right? It's actually necessary for us to do this work if we're going to survive as a species. Okay. Sixth principle. We are learning and working in a lineage of miracle workers. The oldest of this lineage, whose name is known and whose works can be read, is Empedocles. All right. Where are my nerds? Who's heard of Empedocles? Any big Empedocles fans here? Type it in the chat. Come on screen. All right. You're going to love, let me tell you, future nerds, you are going to love learning about Empedocles. He was I was a punk rocker, okay, I don't know about how many of you, we would say in the punk rock scene, Empedocles is punk as fuck. Like truly the GOAT of all punk rockers. And I don't want to give it away because I want you to be excited about reading it in the overview, but his story is phenomenal. We could talk, I'm probably not going to be able to stop myself. We'll talk about it a little bit. Okay. So I hope you're excited about being in the lineage of Empedocles, and you definitely will be when you read the overview. If not, let me know. Also, a short note, we're going to do a brief aside here. If you find the overview too nerdy, you have Matthew to thank for it not being more nerdy. Okay. And if you find my jokes distracting, you have Matthew to thank for there not being more jokes. You can send him an email. If you want there to be more nerdiness and more jokes, you should send Matthew an email saying, when you're editing Crystal's work, let her be more nerdy and let her tell more jokes. So that's how we're going to find the sweet spot here. Okay. Yes, please do. Okay. All right. So I hope you're excited about being in that lineage. All right. Next, and it should say 7th principle on here, but bridge building and web weaving form the heart of our work. We strive to build bridges between the imaginal realm and material reality, between folk wisdom and Western civilized thought. Okay, so that is, that's my primary hope for where we will come in this work. And that bridge building is something that Empedocles did really beautifully. And I'd like for us to kind of hold him as an example in that. Okay, so let's meet him. Let's talk a little bit more about him now. Grandpa Empedocles. I don't know why this is coming up like this. Go back. How do I go back? This is where I need a little bit of help. Okay, so I'm not going to be able to read that little quote from the poem, but it is in the overview. Again, my apologies. Okay, so Empedocles in his lifetime and afterwards was indeed revered as a god by many. So he had scores of followers, right, from all classes who would literally follow him from town to town, adorning him with flowers and adorning him with, beautiful fabrics, looking for him to work healing miracles or just miracles in general, right? So he was he was an extremely successful wandering mage and mystic, right? And what's fascinating about him is that we actually have this, unlike a lot of these figures, we have a lot of records of him, right? We have a lot of records of his writings, both his own writings and accounts of contemporaries. And in addition to that, he actually did establish a huge living lineage, right? So many of the better known philosopher scientists of old stood on his shoulders to create their great work. So for example, Socrates was constantly pulling from Empedocles. A lot of Socrates' ideas on perception, as well as his cosmology, are honestly mimicked from Empedocles' writings. But fortunately for us, that's not uncommon. It's not like Socrates did him dirty or anything. He was just continuing his tradition, and he did so beautifully. Aristotle referred to him as the father of rhetoric, and Galen, whose medicinal or healing lineage we're going to be following, called him the father of medicine. right? So even though he's, lesser known, he was hugely important. Nice. Lindsay's looking at a statue of Sophocles. Back arrow, if I press backspace, would that have made it go back? I'll try later. I'm a little hesitant because I've had really bad luck. 12th house Mercury over here with making this program work successfully. Okay. Right. And Empedocles, one of the reasons he's so cool, he was super unique in his time. He wrote his scientific works only in poetry, which I have a massive amount of respect for, right? So he made sure that his writings were endowed with the beauty that he felt in communing with the natural world, right? He didn't try to make it stale. He didn't try to make it stagnant. Everybody else was writing in prose. He was like, no, this knowledge deserves to be beautiful and deserves to land in people's hearts, right? Because he understood that this kind of happens in the heart. It can only be transmitted through love, through beauty, through the creative act that is inspired by the communion that happens in close observation of the natural world. Right, so hugely important. And also Greece during his time, the ancient world during his time, was becoming more and more patriarchal. Like those of you who understand the ancient Greek world, like women literally were not supposed to leave the house. Like it was really bad. And especially in Athens, less so in other city states, but it was getting bad out there. The patriarchy was really starting to take root. Empedocles had many women students and followers. So he was not down with that. This is probably most likely because he studied with the remnants in the area of the ancient indigenous traditions who were goddess worshippers. Okay, so his writing was hugely inspired by something much older than the Greek tradition. And he was trying to bring that indigenous European wisdom into the contemporary scientific and philosophical conversation in the then being civilized Greece and Italy. And this is the kind of, again, this is where that bridge building work is modeled by Empedocles. And honestly, he could have been viewed as a big weirdo for going around being like, I'm God. Let me show you how I'm God. Right? That was pretty iconoclastic. And he spoke poetically and frequently about his past lives. He could remember being an amoeba. He remembered being a demon. He remembered being a fish. Right? And he shared that with people. And he had some pretty radical ideas, and we're not going to get into all of them. You'll read this in the overview, but one of the things that people remember most about Empedocles is not his life, but how he ended his life. So Grandpa Empedocles jumped into a volcano. Mount Etna, to be exact. And I don't recommend that unless you, like Empedocles, have remembered in detail all of your past lives, can transmute matter at will, have woken a few people up from comas, perhaps you've healed a few people from madness, what else? And left behind a decent amount of works for people to be able to model their lives after yours. Then we can talk about the volcano jump. I believe that Empedocles, even now, is still sentient inside of the magma in Earth's crust, and is in fact guiding the movement of continents with his profound psyche and love. Right? If you think you can do that, but you don't have to, right? We actually need you here. Empedocles has got the whole continent moving thing on lock himself. Okay. Right. Moving on. Right. So, oh yeah, I actually did put that in there. I didn't think I did. I wasn't going to at first. Okay. So now we are going to add to the seven principles of Gaia, the 7 tenets of Empedocles. This is really where we're going to start understanding his thought and shifting some perspective here. And we're going to get into some of the more confusing aspects of what we talked about in the principles. Okay, so the first, like Empedocles, we must strive to be pioneers of the great work of enchanting and doctoring Western thoughts and ways of knowing, because unfortunately, that is our foundation. We can't escape it. You know, we can go completely primal, but we were formed in the wombs of Western civilization. So what we have to do is we have to add to what we have, right? We have to evolve from where we are and not lambast it, not completely reject it, but rather, as I said, doctor it, work with it, right? Allow it to become something new and honor it in that way. Okay. And we must do this in hopes of evolving the way we inhabit these bodies in our homes, Gaia, through the force of love, lest the force of strife have to perform that function to our potential demise, right? So this is going to happen one way or another, and we might as well do it from love, right? Rather than more difficult forces taking the reins, because that's what happens. Change, of course, you know, right, is like the only constant, right? Things are always moving and shifting. And it's rather, you know, do you want to change from, you know, if you don't, you know, it's that thing, like if you don't listen to the angel whispering in your ear, right? The demon's going to have to come chase you, right? And but you're going to move one way or another. Okay. So first tenet, there is no birth. There is no death. There is only the mixing and separation of the 4 primal elements. It is this deep understanding that Empedocles claims leads to the remembrance of your past elemental incarnations, right? So what we want to do, one of the first big perception shifts that we want to start to make is nothing dies. Nothing is born. There is only change. Right? So even the psyche, even this consciousness is still going to be on this planet, right? And so this is something that, you know, matter can be neither created nor destroyed, right? This is something that has been confirmed by physics and does in fact form the first law of physics, right? There is no birth. There is no death. Is a much more poetic, profound, and I feel understandable way to say that first law of physics. Right? There is only change. There is only shifting. That can sound simple, maybe not, but it is something that it produces a profound effect on the psyche when you sit with that idea. Like, I recommend making it a writing prompt. Any of these tenets actually make excellent writing prompts. You know, write it at the top of your medicine journal. There is no birth. There is no death. And see what thoughts flow after that, and let yourself sit with it. Like, what part of you rejects believing that there is no birth and there is no death? Because those are interesting parts to have conversations with. Okay. Second tenet of Empedocles, love/delight is the sole force that forms material reality. This tenet is reflected to us in the Hermetic notion of Venus as the binding and attractive force of the material world. Love and delight create reunification of forms. Okay, so love, delight, Empedocles often refers to as Aphrodite herself, right? The Greek goddess of love. We don't necessarily need to make that one-to-one correlation of love and delight being Aphrodite herself unless that is useful to you, right? Because placing love and delight into a singular form like that, especially because there have been some later myths about Aphrodite and Venus that are actually not so flattering and are a little bit paradoxical. So unless you can perceive Aphrodite as this really pure force of love and delight, I think it's nice to create a little separation. But Empedocles in his day was working with Aphrodite basically as the form to be upheld of the old goddess, like of the old goddess of the goddess worshiping tribes of Europe, right? Who was the mother who birthed everything. And that was how he positioned her, as that prime force that creates matter. Right. And it is, so we are thinking of love and delight as that prime force that creates matter. Okay, so naturally what follows is the third tenet, that strife or hate, who we can also think of as Mars, but that we don't necessarily, Mars or Aries, but we don't necessarily have to, is the sole force that destroys material reality. This tenet, of course, is therefore reflected, but not necessarily one-to-one, as the Hermetic notion of Mars in the separating or repulsive principle in the material world. Strife or hate leads to the destruction of forms, pulls forms apart, disintegrates, makes less than, puts space between. So both love and strife were necessary in the creation of Gaia. Gaia is metaphorically, Gaia is the ballroom in which love and strife dance new elemental realities into being. Right? Because just like that, angel and demon getting you moving, right? They're both going to ignite change. They're both going to ignite evolution. And Empedocles did in fact have a very early idea or full theory of evolution. Right. Fifth tenet, like elements are attracted to one another. Earth builds more earth, fire more fire. This one is pretty simple, and it forms what we will be working with as the law of similars. And when we get into studying particular medicines. All right, sixth tenet. It is through the like elements of your sensory organs that you get to know the external world, or that you get to sense the external world. The fire of the sun is no different, no older, or less powerful than the fire of your eyes. Sensation happens through sympathy between the interior elements and the exterior elements, right? So that fifth tenet that we had of like attracting like, earth attracting earth, right? It's through the fire that lives in my eyes that I can see the color created by the sun on the earth, on Gaia, right? In this principle, later we'll talk about the doctrine of signatures. That's going to help us identify medicines for particular conditions, right? This principle is like where we really get into the juice of how elemental mastery helps us to identify what is right for our bodies or what is needed for somebody else's body in the moment. And that can be done. That's one of the things that can be done through the logical mind. Okay. All right, so here we get to actually read a little quote from Empedocles from his text, The Purifications. For 'tis through earth that earth we do behold, through ether, divine ether luminous, through water, water, through fire, devouring fire, and love through love, and hate through doleful hate. We have a question. Kristen says, and Kristen, if you could type in which tenet you're referring to. This tenet was a very interesting principle that I hadn't fully connected. It seemed aligned with, the sixth. It seemed aligned with Eastern medicine traditions like Ayurveda. Absolutely. I mean, the truth, what's great is the truth always looks the same, right? So we do find a lot of these tenets carried down in the medicine traditions that are unbroken, particularly, of course, TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, and Ayurveda are two very, very wise living traditions that work with a lot of these old principles. I will say TCM through the CCP communism did become a little more disconnected, but there's still a lot of, beautiful ancient wisdom there. Okay, final tenet of Empedocles. To know reality, you must use all of your senses and each limb of your body. This is, of course, where our work will really begin. Right? I feel like this is, perhaps the most important tenet that we need to, continually come back to, right? We can't, and let's hope this poem, let's make this poem come up. I can't say it better than Empedocles. But come by every way of knowing, see how each thing is revealed. Nor having sight, trust sight no more than hearing will bear out. Trust echoing ear, but after tasting tongue. Nor check the proof of all thy members aught. Note by all ways each thing as 'tis revealed. Okay, I feel like that's one of the, I feel like, more beautiful and profound ways of reflecting that truth, that we have to be fully present and we have to trust the knowledge of each cell of our being, right? If we're going to really know another being. And that it's not easy work, right? It requires immense patience, which is something that we feel like we don't have a lot of time of or room for in this world. But I'm hoping in this course that we can box out bigger and bigger spaces of being to be able to do this work of really allowing ourselves to sink into the messages that we receive through each of our members and through each of our senses, and learn how to balance them out, right? When to shift. Like we're a really sight oriented culture. And oftentimes we let sight just be the primary way that we get to know. All right. And so we're going to move into a different phase. In this Gaian creation story, I get into a lot more detail in the overview. So please do still read the overview. But this is, I feel like in the way that I wrote the slideshow, this is maybe even a necessary accompaniment. Like we didn't go into in the slides, there's nothing in the slides that isn't in the written overview, but there are some things in this slide that aren't in the written overview. Just because I'm trying to summarize, but there's a lot more detail in the overview. Okay, so one big thing to know, humans learn best through story. And we are fed in Western society a lot of stories without realizing they're stories, right? So the goal of this creation story is to help you realize what you haven't recognized was a story that you learned, right? Mainly from science. Okay, so little summary. In this section of the pre-lesson, I explain, sometimes comically, because a little bit of comedy also helps us to learn better, the evolution of life on Earth through the lens of Western science, with an eye to where it aligns with the more mystical elemental perspectives, such as Grandpa Empedocles. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to summarize a little bit of that story for you. And what's great, I have a really, really beautiful teacher. I mentioned him in some of my emails, Barnaby Rue. He's hilarious, and he is one of these people, one of these rare, beautiful people who consistently, unbrokenly are walking in both worlds. Can be sitting there having a conversation with you like a normal person, even like doing chores on his phone, and come out and feed you this huge, big, beautiful story about what's happening in the ethers around you. And that is just like an everyday occurrence for him. And he's like amazingly accurate. But my favorite thing when he comes out of journeys or healings, he claps his hands, he goes, "It's a love story." Like every traumatic event that ever happens, he can work with it, and it's a love story. So this creation story is also a love story. Right? So fire meets water, a love story. Life on Gaia began alchemically as fire met water. Right? So the surface of Earth, way back in the day, not for too long, but way back in the day, the surface of Earth was basically just magma. It was fire, right? And this is true in Empedocles' rendition of how the elements manifested also. The Earth was covered with fire. Circling around the Earth, this is in Western science, were probably, we don't know for sure, because it's an extremely hotly debated topic, how water got to Earth, and also when water got to Earth. Well, actually, I think we know now. We know now about when, with a pretty small margin of error, water got to Earth. And it was a really long time ago. But that fire kept the water particles around Earth from coming down because it was too hot, right? So the heat basically just like burned up all of the ancient stardusty water that was circling it. So what's interesting here is the fire, that molten lava, that magma on Earth's surface had to cool down enough, right? It had to be tempered for water to then make her beautiful appearance. And we're going to get into hot and cold in the dance of hot and cold. It's the most important polarity to understand, and it's the most important thing to understand sensuously in order to figure out those polarity shifts in ourselves. That is our only way of knowing, right? We can only know things through opposites. We need contrasts. We need points of comparison. So that's why that's so alchemically important, that we needed that temperature shift for life to become amenable to Earth, right? It's that sweet Goldilocks spot. Okay, so underneath, so when Earth's oceans formed, there were these things called hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor, right? And these hydrothermal vents are still fascinating places, but this is where life began. Within these hydrothermal vents, there's a meeting of magma. So magma is actually still actively pouring out of the ocean floor. And with it, there are all of these gases, these really mineral-rich gases being spewed forth. And the water gets so hot that it actually is just actively dissolving the rock around it, right? So this is a literally, like, you can envision it. It is the most profound, crazy, intense meeting of all of the four elements. It was from this place that life first formed. I already said his views are proven right from science. And that first life was our first, the single-celled organisms known as prokaryotes, like blue-green algae and bacteria. In the overview, I go into this in detail with as many comic asides as Matthew would allow me. With lots of love stories. Okay. Okay, so in this way, plants evolve and they spread to the land. It takes a really, really long time, right? Because these single-celled organisms have to increase the amount of oxygen, air, to a certain percent. It has to get, the atmosphere gets to 21% before life can evolve in complexity. Right? So in this way, we see air as really being that ultimate element of innovation. The complexity of life on Earth, literally in exact proportion, like right when the amount of oxygen starts rising, all these crazy evolutionary occurrences start to happen. I'm gonna check Yes, yes, thank you, Kristen. It was great to have you here. And I just missed letting somebody in. Okay. So plants then evolve inside of the oceans. Well, they're like protoplants, evolve inside of the ocean, and they spread to land. I say here through the dance of love and strife, but in the overview, I tell you specifically, and I think that this is really important, that strife was the development of the first herbivores or predators, right? So it's the evolution of predators, things eating these single-celled organisms, right? These multicellular organisms evolve right when the atmosphere gets to 18%. And then at 21%, these predators, they start feeding, and these single-celled organisms are like, we've got to get out of here, right? So that's strife. That's the demon chasing these single-celled organisms. We have to figure out how to live on land. And then these angelic beings appear. And these angelic beings are mushrooms. Who here loves mushrooms? I love mushrooms. So these single-celled organisms decide to make this partnership, and I give a comical description of the partnership between fungi and these algae. But essentially, what happens is the fungi help the algae to break down nutrients from rock, from stone, right? And the algae help the fungi to get easier access to carbohydrates, right? Because they can get all this beautiful energy really beautifully from photosynthesis from the sun. And together, they make life on land or Earth possible. But these single-celled organisms used to floating around in the ocean, right? Getting their, in addition to getting their nutrients really freely, water is the greatest conductor, right? They were not only getting minerals and nutrients, they were also passing communication through water, right? So they needed to develop another means of having that oneness that was possible in the oceanic womb. So what the fungi and the algae, or plants properly so called now, figure out is neuronostic serotonin, I can't have a hard time saying, serotonergic compounds, right? That allow them to communicate, and not only communicate, but also transfer nutrients, right? They're transferring water, they're transferring minerals, they're transferring other nutrients, and they are transferring communication. They're communing with one another. Through these neuronostic compounds in the fungal network that is developed between their roots, they're able to continue to act as one. They get back to that unity, right? So born of love, right? So that's where, water is love, water is life, right? And so are hallucinogens, but we don't call them hallucinogens. We can call them, because that connotes that it creates incorrect perception, right? We say neuronostic, they help us to know. Psychedelic is also fine, right? I love entheogenic, right? That which brings us to God, that which brings us to unity. All right, I already said this takes place in an underground neural network. Most of us know have heard of the mycorrhizal network. If you haven't, I describe it in the overview pretty thoroughly. But so an issue occurs, okay? So plants previously, they're, beautifully connected through their roots and it's working out, but there's this whole airy realm above them, and they realize, well, I want to reach up into the air, right? I want to get closer to the sun. So the angelic fungi, offer them a vascular system. I don't know why this is incorrect. It's just vascular. It's not vasculature. So they develop essentially the progenitors of our veins and arteries, right? So there's these little tubes that allow water to go up and that allow their leaves to transpire, that creates like a pump for water, right? So previously plants were just itty bitty. They were just these hornworts and mosses, like club mosses, and they could not get very big at all, right? Because they had to be close to the water. They had to be close to that mycorrhizal network in order to get their nutrients. So, but now they can grow really big. But what happens, so we have these ferns, like the size of skyscrapers, right? But now there's all of this mass of the plant. There's all of these members, all of these sensuous organs of the plants that are really far away from that mycorrhizal network, right? So they're getting lonely and they're getting bored. So they need to figure something out, right? Boredom, the mother of invention. Then they need to adapt, right? Strife is still out there. There are still herbivores. They need to adapt. So they develop other serotonergic compounds like DMT, like cannabinoids, right? Other entheogens like mescaline, right? That can allow their above ground parts to communicate, right? And what are we? We're essentially aerial plants, right? We will, and you'll get to that. You'll get to that in the overview. But so we also in our bodies contain these above ground neurognostic serotonergic compounds, right? Your body contains cannabinoids. Your body contains DMT. You make all of those things endogenously because you too have a need to co-evolve with your environment in the ethers. Oh, hold on, let me. Daniel says, I really wish you taught my botany class back in college. I do too. I wish I taught your botany class. No, I do what I can. Okay, so I already said that. Okay, so I'm going to give a little aside here. That we will get into later in the course, but that I do feel like it's important to understand that, yes, we have cannabinoids and DMT in our body endogenously, and they can be activated and heightened in many ways that we will discuss throughout the course. And also, I feel like it's important to know that back in the day, when life was less complicated, when humans spent most of their time, in the elements, that when our survival was dependent upon the survival of the other than human world around us, we had much easier access to the open states of perception that our endogenous serotonergic compounds give to us. Right? Like, I don't say that to make you sad, right? Like, I've kind of held my tongue talking about this in a lot of different courses because it can give us this kind of like golden age mentality, like, oh, I wish I could go back. But I'm just letting you know that it's like, that's not lost. It's like, yes, our ancestors were much more open to these things. They were able to be much more like I was describing Barnaby as, we're just like constantly walking in two worlds, right? Like, you can be, cooking your breakfast and also watching a vision play out in your backyard, right? And I believe that we can get back to that, right? But I don't want to think of it as getting back to, right? It's just like activating that part of ourselves and that, older, more ancient part of ourselves, and not having to also dismiss what we have now. Okay, I hope that was helpful for somebody. Okay, yeah, I already said you too are in many ways an aerial plant. Okay, so dream time as your birthright, right? So these states of perception that open up through these neurognostics, for us, sometimes they can seem very chaotic and very unreal, much more like our dreams, but it is a place in and of itself. A lot of the times when it seems very confusing, It's because our brain is simply not, our brain needs to get used to, right? Like, and our brain needs to feel safe being in that place, right? Which is why it's so important that that's why we're making dream work a really central part of this class, right? And it's getting darker. I think I need to turn a light on. I'll be right back. Okay. So, right, that state, we call it dream time, right? And indigenous peoples and many other wise peoples try not to think of it as something that doesn't actually exist, right? It's something that exists, but that we don't place the amount of importance on as we do, you know, our desk or our spatula, like something that's going to assist in what allows us to survive, right? So that's why we need to do this work of changing our perception of what survival even is, right? Of what dying, like, because so much of what we focus our attention on and allow ourselves to see as real, right, is fear, like I might die. But if I stop seeing this desk as just a desk, I might die. Like there's a part of our brain that tells us that story. And that's why our perception is so limited. That's why we don't allow our endogenous serotonergic compounds to do their work, right? And so that's why we need to change our perception around that. Okay, so it's essential for our health to be able to tap into dreamtime realms of possibility where our plant brethren and all of our other than human brethren live the whole of their lives in order to be well. And this is especially important for us to start forming an ally relationships with the other than human world, such as the medicinal plants and stones that we're going to be working with in this course. Okay, because it's important for our health, because remember, we need to do this spontaneous adaptation that plants are so good at with them. And we are meant to be doing that spontaneous adaptation. And honestly, all of the problems of the modern world will be figured out if we start to bring in these much more ancient intelligences who know how to survive here, who know how to adapt here. It's like we're the only ones out of the loop, right? I love seeing Jules says, I love that I often see green leaves and bushes when I'm drifting off. That is a great sign, Jules. Right, and I know you have to sign off. I'm going to try to wrap this up here. Okay, so dream time's your birthright. Right, little poem from Emily Dickinson, because Emily Dickinson knew it was up. I dwell in possibility. That realm of possibility is a dream time. A fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior for doors, of chambers as the cedars, impregnable of eye, for an everlasting roof, the gambrels of the sky. Of visitors the fairest, for occupation this, the spreading wide my narrow hands to gather paradise. So a good poem is worth reading twice. I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior for doors, of chambers as the cedars, impregnable of eye, and for an everlasting roof the gambrels of the sky, of visitors the fairest, for occupation this, the spreading wide my narrow hands to gather paradise. If anybody wants to discuss this poem in more detail in the group, I would be very willing, but I do want to be cognizant of time here, and I want to have time for questions. So we're going to start to wrap up. We are getting towards the end here. I need to move this little window again. Okay, so close observation, it's everything. It is the primary gift of neurognostics for our purposes. It gives us the ability to slow down and expand our perception, something that we find particularly hard in this world. And we talked about that a little bit already. Talked about this too. This requires cultivating patience and sensitization to new feeling tones in the body. And sensitization to new feeling tones in the body absolutely does require patience. And I want you all to give yourselves infinite patience in this work. And I want you to celebrate your smallest victories. Celebrating those small victories goes such a long way. You will be able to hold on to your progress and change huge parts of your life if you celebrate those very, very, very little steps where you feel just a little bit more, or you can name a new kind of sensation, or you draw a new connection. Like, please come in the group and we will celebrate you immensely. Like, write it down. There's some things you want to keep close to your chest. Totally get that. We can talk more about that also, but you want to give gratitude, please, when those shifts happen. Close observation also requires special attention be paid to the effects of different sensory stimuli to various parts of the body. In these categories, we are going to be breaking down throughout the course. Right. So and this is also that we're going to build on this a little bit. We're going to start just kiss it basically in the exercise at the end here, because remember, there's another lesson coming out next week. All right. Journaling is essential right now as you do this work. Even though our ancestors didn't really use written technology as much, everything was more conversational. Journaling, writing is an excellent way, even if you never read it again. Right, you use way more neurons. And I think you're like, honestly, I think it's something ridiculous. I exaggerate numbers in my head sometimes, but I think it's like you're 20 times more likely to remember something if you write it down. It might not be that high, but it's like really high, right? You're going to remember something more. You create new neural networks and you can use that information more readily if you write it down. So please journal as you do this work of testing out different sensory stimuli and using intelligence from different parts of your body to commune. It's going to help you. Yeah, the journaling is going to help you build new vocabulary for sensation. Even if you're not giving something a new name, right, the new vocabulary will come. Like, that's something that you barely even have to put much work into. And you want to really, really make sure you write down and celebrate any intuitive or psychic hits that you get doing this work. All of this building up to learning the doctrine of signatures. The doctrine of signatures, as it was handed down to us, was actually done with a really Western mindset. And so that's like a good thing, right? Because the doctrine of signatures is a tool that we're going to be able to use that doesn't require anything more than the sensitization of the senses that we have right now. A lot of the doctrine of signatures is very easily done just through sight, right? But it gets us off to a really good foot for the deeper work to happen, right? So this was called the language of God for a really long time, even in Europe, right? So Paracelsus, who is a much later, really awesome, also super punk rock, philosopher, scientist, much like Empedocles, he really wrote, like almost quite literally wrote the book on the doctrine of signatures in the West. But it's something that peoples all over the world have, right? Like when I studied with the people, we went on plant walks, they use the doctrine of signatures. Like everybody uses the doctrine of signatures. All right, so it works out the rule of Empedocles that like is drawn to like, thus building what we call sensual similes in the world around us. We can also call them rhymes, right? It's like something that looks like something else. It's a very natural childlike mindset. So it's almost like a return to this innocence that it's like, oh, this looks like this. That must mean something. And it does. Almost always. It does mean something. We just need to put more sophistication around it. Right. Yeah, it's always been a reliable means of knowing the personality of an other than human friend. These sensual similes can be sensed visually through taste, color, growth pattern, and environments. The overview itself gives you a lot of examples. Okay, and these similes have been read across all of Gaia's human cultures to help read, most specifically in the West, the medicinal properties of plants. But all cultures do, there is a primary emphasis on using the doctrine of signatures for healing and finding healing plants and stones. All right, so the next work, building the capacity to feel. I think these are out of order. Okay, there we go. All right. The best work, this work is best done in relationship, right? Like we can feel ourselves a lot. And like in yoga and when you're doing somatic practices, or if you're processing something, you know, that's something that you can do without that kind of outside stimuli. But for our purposes, we're going to be doing it in relationship with another so that we can learn that communication. So for this exercise, this is just kissing this work, right? You're going to take yourself out and find a plant. You can use a house plant if you like, but we want some living being, right? We'll just a plant, right? For now, I'm assuming like even if you live in a city, you can go out and find a tree, right? You're going to position yourself as close to that plant as feels good to you. And then ask yourself simply, how does this plant feel right now? Right? Let yourself recognize it is a consciousness, right? We know it does have feelings. All of the studies have been done on it. I give you some very humorous studies in the overview. Wait for a sensation to come to you, right? So you're drawing that line of empathy. All you have to do is place your focus on that plant. Wide-angled vision and heart-centered awareness always helps, right? Just heart-centered awareness is super easy. Feel your heart. Literally, just place your awareness into your heart. It can be super subtle. It will grow. And then just like I did in the, a lot of you have done this with me, you're going to notice your peripheral vision. You know, you can start in small. You want it to get wider and wider, but you're going to gaze at that plant while feeling your heart as much as you can and be aware of the whole circle, this big circle that your mind, that your consciousness, that your heart is literally at the center of. This is going to potentize the sensations that come to you from this plant. So you need to wait. Right? Again, it takes patience. Some of you might get something like right away. Even if you get something right away, still sit. Let yourself sit there long enough that it feels uncomfortable, right? Because that's how we're going to build capacity, right? You want to get right to that edge. You know, just like in a yoga pose, you know, when you want to get out is when the pose really starts, or meditation, you know, meditation doesn't really start until you're like, I'm feeling a lot of stuff here, right? Do this in the same way. Let yourself feel with this plant until you get a little bit uncomfortable, and then sit a little longer and keep those feelings coming, right? Then you're going to try this same exercise. So you're going to journal, right? Right after that, you want to go journal. Then try it with a stone. Stone is a very, very different kind of other than human being, right? So we're building points of comparison here. You're going to hold it in your left palm. And this is going to help us build vocabulary because we know everything by polarities, right? Notice the difference in feeling sensations between the two. Between this two. We often use the left palm because the left is closer to the heart. Probably works in the right as well. The more different kinds of life that you do this work with, and the more detailed your sensual vocabulary is going to become, the easier it's going to become for you to make sophisticated distinctions. But this is something we're going to be doing throughout this course, so don't feel like you have to get this all right now. Remember, let it be small. All right, and secondly, with both of these, with both the plant and the stone, and then, you know, even after the journaling, right? Because there's a different kind of process that happens with the journaling when we put things in words, and we're going to talk about that more too. But spend some amount of time noticing the after effects of your communion with that other human being, because those after effects, that's the lasting medicine, right? So that's how we get to know how this being, how this stone, how this plant works in our bodies, right? How that medicine lives in our bodies, right? Because just because a plant is poisonous, right? Like, doesn't mean it's bad. It means that there's a dissimilarity between you and that plant, right? That you can't ingest it, or maybe not even touch it, right? Which is why it's respectful to keep a little distance from a plant at first, right? To take it slow, right? When we do our rituals, we're going to spend some time just sitting with a cup of tea, right? Just like sitting with a plant, smelling, slowly gaining more and more intimacy, right? Okay. I believe we're almost at the end here. Record your findings in the medicine journal. Yep. All right. Questions, comments, concerns. How does that feel to everybody? Alicia, yes.
Thank you so much for everything. This has been so great. I'm loving it. So I noticed that we're working with stinging nettle first. I'm assuming this is dry, or are we supposed to find live plants?
So so we're primarily working with dry, but I am going to be encouraging those of you who live in areas where nettles grow, which is very, very many places. This is a great season that we're in to forage. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Like, if you can get your hands on some fresh plants, that's awesome.
I do have, I have a little patch in my backyard, but I live very far north and I don't know, everything's still kind of under snow.
Oh, where do you live?
I live in Saskatchewan, so it's right in the middle of Canada. Yeah.
Sweet. Well, I mean, the medicine's going to be potent, right? Like, medicines are potent up north, right?
Yeah.
So when the snow leaves, I recommend you do a deep dive, because nettles are awesome fresh.
Okay.
This is going to sound maybe a little masochistic. Stinging yourself with nettles is actually awesome, right?
Okay.
So there's a thing, it is used in TCM, some of you may know, it's called urtication, right? And it's actually the progenitor of acupuncture, right? Like, urtication came before acupuncture. To like release stuck or stagnant energy, hit yourself with nettles in that area, and it's super healing. Not like incredibly pleasant, but really, really good for breaking up stagnant energy, for adding more chi, right? So it's like excellent for arthritis. Like, if you get like achy knees or achy joints, urtication is fantastic. And nettles have, a lot of people like to forage nettles really early in the season because they have less of that compound that creates the stinging effect when they're young. I personally really don't mind harvesting nettles when they're older. A lot of people use gloves. Honestly, and again, this is going to sound a little bit sick, but I kind of halfway enjoy the sensation of that sting, and I will harvest later and get that.
That's amazing. Thank you.
Get that stimulus. So anyway, yeah. Other questions?
I have a question.
Yes, Gina.
I'm glad I know about your nettle kink now. That's interesting.
It is a kink.
So you were talking earlier about gaining intimacy with plants and starting to sort of trust the downloads that you get. You and I have talked about this. I've gotten some
Yes, we
very,
have.
very clear stuff, and then I've gotten some stuff that was not clear. So what would you recommend? in
Thank
terms
you.
of how we can start to trust what, and how do we, like, there's a filter, there's projection, there's,
I feel you.
there's wish fulfillment, there's my stuff that can get in the way of clear communication.
Yep.
And I would love some guidance or your thoughts on like how to get more clarity.
So you're bringing up a really big point, Gina, and I'm really glad that this is coming up now. And this is definitely, I decided, actually, just today I was thinking about this. I thought about it earlier in the course, right? But so basically what you're talking about, Gina, is we want to be trauma informed, right? We have, being as disconnected as we've been for centuries, many of us, we have a lot of trauma. We have a lot of fear, right? Like we're very, very sympathetic, right? Most of us spend, I talked about this before. It's like there are middle schoolers with adrenal burnout, right? Like we're so overstimulated, and trauma is super common. It's really difficult to find people on this planet right now who aren't traumatized, and that does very particular things. And I know, Gina, that you know this from your work with somatic experiencing. I just putting it out there. I love somatic experiencing, by the way, and somatic experience is an excellent accompaniment to the work that we do in this course. When I was talking earlier about dreamtime images, right, and how we can be really confused by dreamtime images and what we see when we work with psychedelics, right? Like why we call them hallucinogens, like why they're not like as consistently like clear and potent. That is a result of trauma, right? And that is a result of there being a fear, like a really, really primal fear around entering into that deeply parasympathetic state, like that state where we trust, where we can just relax, like the free floating green algae single cell soaking up, life in the sun for 2.5 billion years, right? Like that single celled organism did not have to worry about anything, right? And that's what life meant for most of the time that there has been life on this planet. It has been relaxation, right? So because we haven't necessarily experienced, we're not used to staying in that super relaxed space, a lot of different projections, right? A lot of difficult things will come up and come up to be processed, right? Like, so those false negatives, those false positives, those really confusing amalgamations of images or memories that come up, what feels like the emptying out of the junk pile of the psyche. It's like, that's what, at the moment, there's something in that, right? There's something medicinal in that you need to consciously sort, right? Because it's something that's stuck in the subconscious, that thinks it needs to be stuck in the subconscious in order for you to survive, in order for you to not die, right? Which is why it's so important that we rely and really build on some of those foundational principles that we talked about in the beginning of the course. But yes, that stuff is going to come up, right? Which is why it's really good for us to stay slow and not try to jump ahead with making really concrete predictions or assessments, right? Like a lot of us want to go right to being fully psychic, right? And many of us are pretty close to fully psychic, but there's still stuff in there that needs to be worked out. And that stuff will be worked out in the slow, in the purely sensual, right? In the what does my finger know from this? And the what do my thighs know from this? What do they know? Right? And that's going to be a sensation. We can trust sensation, right? we can trust feeling tones. So we want to rest there for as long as we need to before putting a word to it even. Right? And we're going to talk about words. Words are tricky. Words are really tricky. Symbols are really tricky. Right? We need to rest in sensation for a while to get to that safe place where those kinds of interpretations and psychic and intuitive hits really land, right? But those psychic and intuitive hits that you get are still going to be useful, right? Images and symbols that you get are going to be useful, but they might be telling you more about you than about the plant or the stone. But it's still a message from the plant or the stone. These things are tricky. Everybody hear what I'm saying? Yeah? Great. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Thank you for that, Gina. Any other questions? Or anything else that you would like me to expand upon in some way? If not, we are past the 90-minute mark. And I would like to try to, especially since this is actually like a shorter piece, it's making me a little bit nervous that these are going to go a little bit longer than I was expecting. But hopefully nobody's too upset about that. I can try to be.
There's a question in the chat.
Oh, there's a question
Yeah,
in the chat.
It was for me. And I was just curious if you have any specific techniques for staying slow, because I am really bad at that.
Ooh, okay. Techniques for
Let's say I'm
staying.
challenged by it.
Breath is your best friend. Consistently, as often as you can, noticing the movement of air in your body and how your body moves as you breathe. And actually, I wanted to do this before class. I was intending to do this before class, but I got really excited about getting to the slides. But from now on, and I want everybody to hold me accountable. Gina, you're good at this. We are going to breathe together, and if possible, light a candle and set some intentions before every class so that we can get this information more deeply in our bodies. So thank you for asking that, class, Megan.
Sure.
So Megan, breath, absolutely. And be patient with yourself. Right? It's a little bit of a paradox. Be patient with yourself and being slow. Right?
I'll do my best.
Yeah. Let yourself become comfortable with discomfort. Let's see how annoying I can be with paradoxes. It's a game.
Got a lot of Gemini and Mercury and stuff
And-
in Gemini. I don't know. Everything's opposed in my chart, so I love paradoxes.
Great. Then you should be fantastic at this. Can you tell me what's uncomfortable for you in slowness? What does it feel like? What comes up?
Well, from a conceptual standpoint, my issue is time and a sense that there isn't enough, and it comes from all different places. But when I try to be still, even when I'm not so much in my head, it still comes up for me that that's long enough. That's enough time. So when you were saying to stay with things a little longer, I even got that message just yesterday, which is great. But it always feels like there's not enough time. So I should be, I don't even like to use the word should, but that it's important for me to do other things, or that, I don't know. I can't really put the word to it. I don't think that really fully explains it, but it's that the discomfort is that, I can't explain it other than I know it's around time.
So you know that in general, that feeling of there not being enough time is linked to a fear of death.
Well, that makes sense. simply because I'm in a transitional stage, and that has been a big theme around mortality for me, not with any particular reason other than recognizing I have probably lived longer than I will live.
Right, right. So those foundational concepts of there is no birth,
Yeah.
there is no death, will be really useful for you to meditate on. And
Yeah.
also the scientific proven reality that time does not actually exist. One of my favorite quotes is from this Italian mathematician, Carlo Rivoli. Anyway, I can look it up. But
I'll
it's
remember it as ravioli now. Thank you.
I know, but it's not ravioli, but I'm always afraid that I'm making it into ravioli, but it's something like ravioli. Is time is simply an effect of our ignorance to detail.
Ooh.
Time is simply an effect of our ignorance to detail. And if you sit with that quote after you read the section, after you read the creation story and the overview, it's going to blow your mind. Because what neurognostics do is they open up awareness of detail. Yes, Dunny's just, two people gave some good advice in the chat. You have to be willing to become slow, right? So that's our dealing with the fear of death thing. And slow moves you out of time. Detail, attention to detail moves you out of time. And this is a real ass thing. Like real. Time, you can get more of it.
That sounds like flow state too. When you're in flow state,
Yep.
There is no time.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Which is a result of synchronistic coevolution and adaptation with your environment. Right?
Thank you.
Yeah, we can get into this will be a theme we work with. So this isn't the end of either of these conversations that we've started with Gina and Megan here. And thank you for that, Stacy, and for everybody that's okay. So priestess, please correct my pronunciation. Enodia, or Lisa, writes, I have a big problem with not having enough time to do everything I need to do. I have a hard time with being slow, but if I can do it, I love it and feel much better afterwards. It's all of these things are issues with the sympathetic nervous system state. It really is. It's like this urgency we feel. This sounds so simple, but it really works if you can just get your breath to a 7-minute inhale, 7-second inhale, 7-second hold, 7-second exhale, 7-second hold, square breath. If you get it to that 7-second mark, your consciousness will shift. And it won't feel so hard. Like, I'm not saying that that's going to fix everything, right? Like that sounds cheap, but sometimes you just need that little, like we all have these keys and they're a little bit different for everybody, but we all have these keys. It's like a coming home, right? Everybody needs, and this is something we're going to talk about later. Everybody needs to know what really brings them home. Like what moves the energy that is afraid to move. For some people, it's back bends, right? Like, and I love me a good back bend. Like if I'm like feeling stuck and I can't do anything, I, go to the wall, reach back and, get my heart up, get the blood moving. And there'll be a little like pulse, a little, like hit of my endogenous DMT. And we can all do that. We all have ways to ignite that. Inversions, fantastic. That's why, there's lots of people who said, do a back bend and an inversion every day. And by God, I think that's incredibly important. And one is probably not enough. But that square breath, do that for a minute or two, it can help and it can get you into that flow where it becomes a little bit, it becomes a little bit easier. In
Can
that,
I speak real quick?
oh yeah,
Divine?
please,
I
please.
couldn't figure out how to put my hand up. I am, now that you mentioned it, I am familiar with that from another teacher of mine. And when she, I did it with her, it does work real well. And I have fibromyalgia and I'm disabled physically. I mean, I've been moving around, but I'm just now able to take care of my house after 7 years.
Wow.
There's so much deep cleaning to do. And so my body gets tired, but my right leg doesn't bend all the way. I used to be very flexible. So like with the back bend thing and everything, it just sucks, so if
Thank you
I
so
might-
much for your work. Like, thank you so much for your healing work.
oh yeah, I mean, I'm still healing every day. Do you know what I mean? And I'm determined. I believe I can get my knee to bend again all the way. I've talked to different physical therapists, and it might take me 7 years, but it'll happen. Right? So yeah, I know I have a lot of stuck energies, but that does work the square breath.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up because I've been going through a real lot lately. So I forget all my tools, or keys. So thank you.
That's why we need community.
True. And I don't have one. I'm in the middle of the woods. I prefer not to be around people because,
We're here
different
for
things,
you.
but yeah. Thank you. I appreciate
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And it is Enodia.
Enodia, wonderful, wonderful,
thank
beautiful
you.
name. And Gina, thank you for mentioning. Cacao has been amazing for flow states. Breath, cacao, yoga, equal transcendent. Completely agree. And Gina's not paying me to say this, but Gina makes some fabulous cacao. Very excited. You can post that in the group. She's the sweet dark. And Alicia says, thank you. Alicia had to go. Okay. All right. Beautiful conversations, everybody. I feel like this is a really nice place to stop, unless somebody, I'm going to give us, does anybody, wait, Chloe, you had your hand up. Are you still here, Chloe? Chloe might not be here. Does anybody else have anything that they'd like to share that you feel like would be better handled live and on a call rather than inside of the group, rather than inside of the Mighty Network? Going once? Going twice? Gina, you can feel free to post a link to your herbal cacao creations in the group. Cynthia would like a link. Right. Going 3 times? I'm going to give us a 4th time in honor of Empedocles and the 4 primeval elements. All right. Well, this is it for this meeting, everybody. And I look forward to seeing you within the group. And I look forward to seeing you next week. All right. Bye, everyone.